Less than a decade after arriving in Canada, Nordstrom is leaving and liquidation sales at their department stores are underway. In Ontario, a court gave the U.S. retailer's Canadian branch permission to start selling off its merchandise. The CBC's Megan Fitzpatrick has the latest from near a Nordstrom store in downtown Toronto.
There was a big crowd here this morning, Arthi, before the doors opened. Some eager shoppers looking for those deals. And what they found inside the store was about 5% off is sort of the baseline sale that's being offered in the stores right now. Some outerwears in the neighborhood of about 20%. No signs up yet alerting shoppers of what the deals are. So they were having to ask the sales associates what they could get on sale because this liquidation sale was just approved by that court yesterday, giving the green light for this to go ahead. This whole process of Nordstrom leaving Canada is being overseen by the courts because they're using what's called the Companies Creditors Arrangement Act, which is a way for companies to restructure and wind down their businesses. So it was a bit of a last-minute scramble this morning in terms of these sales starting. They will be underway for a couple of weeks. Nordstrom expected to shut down their stores by late June. 6 stores across Canada, as well as 7 Nordstrom Rack stores, which, as you mentioned, have been open since 2014, and they just weren't doing well enough to stay open, with the company deciding to pull the plug. And that, unfortunately, is going to mean in the neighborhood of 2,500 employees losing their jobs. Now, in terms of whether shoppers are finding their deals here, I think I did speak to a couple who were disappointed that it was only 5% to start, and they were kind of struggling with, oh, do I go ahead and buy what I want at only 5%, or do I wait to see if the discounts get any deeper? But then the things they want might be gone. I did speak to one shopper who bought some sunglasses for 5% off, a luxury brand that he says never goes on sale, so he was happy to get his hands on those.
So, of course, the deals are one part of this, but really we're also talking about some job losses that you discussed there. What more do we know about that?
Yeah, I just confirmed with Nordstrom this morning where things were at on that. And they do say that employees are being kept in the loop about what's going on and given all the latest information and in terms of developments. And they also say they'll continue to work as scheduled during the wind down period. Employees at the stores, they're generally going to get at least 8 weeks written notice advising of their final day of employment once that final day is determined. And Nordstrom says they've also set up an employee trust, Arthi, that will ensure that they continue to get their salaries and benefits during that notice period. So that's what we know sort of on that part of the process. But again, yeah, a lot of employees across the country will be losing their jobs in the coming weeks as Nordstrom pulls out of Canada.
CBC's Megan Fitzpatrick in Toronto. Now, we do want to stay on the story. For that, I want to bring in Doug Stevens in Ancaster, Ontario. He's the founder and CEO of Retail Profit, a retail industry consultancy. Thank you for making time for us today.
My pleasure, Arthi.
Okay, so liquidation, as we heard, starts today for Nordstrom stores across the country. Nordstrom is closing all 13 of their stores in Canada. Why did the retailer face such trouble with profitability and eventually its demise in this country?
Well, I think it was really just a remarkable set of circumstances. I mean, we can't forget, first of all, what brought Nordstrom to Canada in the first place. In the aftermath of the financial crisis in the U.S. and the slow recovery of the economy in the U.S., Canada started to look like a good bet. And so in 2014, Nordstrom came, but it takes years to establish a brand in a new market, in a new country with new consumers, new sensibilities, new preferences in terms of products. It takes time to figure that out. And then, of course, the obvious. We went through a pandemic that must have been excruciating for Nordstrom, considering that they didn't really have a fully fledged online presence or game at that point. So when you put that all together and then you look at their situation now staring down the barrel of what could be a potential recession, I think they just made the probably prudent decision to pull up stakes and invest in their core business in the U.S.
We know also, of course, today that those liquidation sales are starting and lots of customers are rushing to find a bargain. But we heard some are disappointed with the discounts not being deep enough. So what can we actually expect when it comes to that? When you hear liquidation sale, you think prices are really going to be slashed, not 5%.
Yeah, you do. And it is a common misconception around these kinds of liquidations. And as was mentioned earlier, this is a court administered bankruptcy. It's a court administered liquidation of inventory. There is a monitor that is appointed to oversee the process, and then two companies that are actually managing the liquidation. But the obligation of the monitor and the liquidators is not to sell whatever they can for whatever they can get. Their obligation is to actually recoup as much as is feasible. They have to make best efforts to recoup as much money as possible because, of course, these proceeds are what will be funding both secured and unsecured creditors going forward. So, I actually recall during the Target exit from Canada, during that liquidation, consumers were actually going into store and they were peeling up price tags and finding that the liquidator's price was actually above the regular price of the merchandise. And that's the liquidator's discretion to do so.
And there's a tip for those bargain hunters there. And of course, you mentioned Target's exit from the Canadian market. And we've seen numerous American retail closures in the country, such as Target, Bed Bath & Beyond, and now Nordstrom. So why do these department stores seem to fail in Canada but survive in the U.S.?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a fair question. And certainly there's been a narrative, developing that perhaps, there's just there's something wrong with Canada or with Canadian consumers. But I think it's very difficult to make comparisons between the Target debacle, and certainly it was a debacle really from the time they entered the country, just a series of operational missteps, PR blunders, and Canada was Target's to lose, and lose it they did. Nordstrom was a different situation. Nordstrom is a very good company. I think they came into the country putting their best foot forward. But again, I just don't think they had the time to establish themselves before the pandemic hit. And then, what the fallout was obvious. So I don't look at this as a Canada problem. And I think we only have to look at brands like Walmart, Home Depot, Costco to make a very solid case for the idea that, yeah, Canada is a great country to operate in. And in fact, you can dominate in this country if you do it right.
Doug, thank you for your time today. That is Doug Stevens in Ancaster, Ontario. He's the founder and CEO of Retail Profit, a retail industry consultancy.